Namaste, everybody. This is Arjun from America, and I'm making this channel basically because I feel that the discourse that I see on Hinduism coming from people like myself, Hindus who were born and raised here in the West, tends to either be lacking and uninformed, or it tends to be offering an overly Abrahamized version of Hinduism. And I think both of these are they're really indicative of being totally divorced from an Indian cultural framework and rootedness in Indian culture. So I thought, you know what, instead of just continuing to complain about this to people that I know, let me actually get out there and start the conversation, make a YouTube channel so that hopefully more conversations get started, the narrative, the mindset can kind of move in a different direction, and we can all learn and benefit from it. So, just a little bit about myself. Like I said before, I was born and raised here in the U.S., specifically the Midwest, as you're probably aware from the way that I speak English. My parents are immigrants from India. They come from the state of Karnataka. So, I was raised speaking Kannada and, of course, also English. And I was only exposed to Hindi a little later, and then I've been able to pick up maybe half of conversational Hindi in terms of understanding and following it, though I can't speak it, it's definitely a project of mine that I'm working on. And that actually brings me to the first thing that I wanted to talk about, which is language. If you're watching this and you're in India, I'm 100% sure that you're fluent in at least one language in addition to your mother tongue, because India is a largely bilingual society, and many people are trilingual, or they know, four languages, five languages, or more, speaking, their mother tongue and either probably Hindi or maybe English or maybe both, and even other regional languages quite possibly. But here in the United States, where I live, everybody speaks English. Obviously, outside of some people who are Hispanic and only speak Spanish, and other isolated pockets of people, everybody speaks English. And so there is no practical reason for people to actually know any other language than English, and the vast majority of the population does not know any other language than English. And so for people like us, second generation people whose parents came from another country and we were raised speaking another language, it's something that we have to purposely try to keep up by speaking it with our family. Many of us lose touch with that, including me personally, even though, our parents will continue to speak to us in that language. But the reason that this is very important for Hindus in particular is because India, as we all know, is a very linguistically diverse society. Even though a large proportion of the large majority of Indians speak Hindi, at least to some degree, more than half of them natively speak a language that is not Hindi, meaning they natively speak a regional language. And the issue comes that when they come to this country, they will speak to their children in their regional language. And of course, they'll pick up English as well, that they're also taught by, their parents and the school and so on and so forth. But unless they're native Hindi speakers, they're not going to expose them much to Hindi. So Gujarati parents will speak to their kids in Gujarati, Bengali parents will speak to their kids in Bengali, and so on. And so people aren't really getting exposed to Hindi nearly as much as they would if they were in India. And so when we try to speak with other, Indian American Hindus of the second generation, we have to speak to them in English because it's the only language that we can all communicate in. And of course, English is not an Indian language. It's the language that we communicate with, our white friends and with people at large in society in that same language. And so there's no way to kind of feel a sense of cultural camaraderie with the English language because people don't have that. People use English because it's practical and it's the only language that's really spoken here. Um, Having a language that is common to you is two things. One, it's got to be common to your group. And secondly, and just as important as that, it has to be not spoken by the rest of society. So English, of course, it's spoken by Indian Americans, but it's also spoken by other Americans. Indian languages are not spoken by people who are not Indian, obviously. And so to me, my solution to this is always, if you can speak at least some Hindi coming here from some non-Hindi speaking state, then you should speak Hindi to your kids instead of your regional languages. So that way, whether you're, Kannadiga, Bengali, Gujarati, Marathi, whatever the case may be, you can, you can, your kids can speak to one another in a language that is Indian, but a language that also unites them, which of course would be Hindi, which is the only Indian language where, maybe 70-75% of Indians speak Hindi. No other Indian languages has more than like 10% of the Indian population. So that should be kind of obvious to people. And the reason that this is not taken up, I think, is a couple of reasons, basically two. One is people that come here from India, they tend to have learned Hindi at least as a second language. And so when you've learned Hindi as a second language, you feel that, oh, I know Hindi, I can communicate with people in Hindi. And so Hindi doesn't really become an issue to people who have learned it as a second language or a third language. But they also, and this brings me to my next point, they also have these kind of sentimental, nostalgic connections to their mother tongue. So even if they may understand intellectually that your kid is going to be able to communicate with fewer Indian people if you teach them this narrow regional language as opposed to Hindi, which is a national language, they're thinking, I was raised speaking this language. I have all these kinds of sentimental, nostalgic feelings towards. I remember speaking this with my parents, and I want my kids to be able to speak to their grandparents in this language that's our mother tongue, so on and so forth. And I think none of that really means anything to people who are trying to cultivate a cohesive, coherent Hindu identity. Your own desires from your own family are really none of my business, but what I can tell you is this: you sure as hell cannot teach kids more than one foreign language because, as I said earlier, people only hold on to one other language by expressed, purposeful effort that they're making. So the Chinese kids, they purposely hold on to Mandarin or Cantonese, whichever they speak. The Korean kids are purposely holding on to Korean, right? The difference there is Korea is a mono-ethnic society. So any Korean that they would meet, they speak the same language. With Spanish, Mexican kids can speak Spanish to one another. They can also speak Spanish to Puerto Ricans, Cubans, Dominicans, all these other kinds of Hispanic groups that they may come across. But we are the one unique society, unique society with a substantial population, where we're actually not united by language. We're divided by these various regional languages that people speak. And it's only with the use of Hindi that we can find both commonality in language, but also a distinction from the West. And now I want to shift to this. Having a language that's in common to you is important for a couple reasons. One, it gives you a sense of identity because identity is always made up of two things, the same kinds of things I mentioned with the language earlier. It has to tell you who you are, and it also has to tell you who you are not. Meaning, if you speak Hindi, you see any other Hindi speaker as who you are, and you see those who do not speak in Hindi as who you are not. And of course, Muslims you can kind of separate from the group who speaks Hindi because you can consider them as speaking Urdu because they tend to, of course, speak more Urduized versions of Hindi than we would. And so you're creating a boundary that you're staying within, and you're also creating a boundary to exclude others. But when you teach regional languages to your kids, then I am in a Kannadiga box, and a Telugu kids are in a Telugu box, and Tamilians are in a Tamil box, and all these different people who are Hindu are in one specific group because they speak this regional language, and this is, of course, excluding the people who do not speak that language. So that's all I've got for this video. Please, if you are Indian and thinking about coming to the United States or any other English-speaking Western country, I would say speak to your kids in Hindi and forget about all of this sentimentalism that you have with your mother tongue. That stuff belongs in Indian society. It's great in India where everybody speaks multiple languages. It's not good here because it's very difficult and it's a lot of work to keep up with another language.